Congresswoman, thank you so much for sitting down with us. Last year, you were a key member of the House Armed Services Quality of Life panel. This year, you're taking over as ranking member of the Personnel Subcommittee. So
Yep.
that same issue, what do you see as the top priorities this year on the personnel side, especially given all of the stuff that you and the committee did accomplish last year?
So I think that the remainder of the work that was sort of left behind is some of the top priorities of the Quality of Life panel, transitioning now into the Military Personnel Subcommittee. Some of those had to do with housing allowances, and some of them had to do with some of the issues of women's health as well. I think that my biggest job is to make sure we stay focused on quality of life in the Military Personnel Subcommittee panel, and not on extraneous conversations about wokeism in the military, as an example. I think sometimes those are red herrings, not even sometimes, but always. And I think it's really important that the work of the Military Personnel Subcommittee be about military personnel and their quality of life and the quality of life of their families as well.
That was part of the interesting relationship last year with that special panel. It really did get to just dive into those issues, while the Personnel Subcommittee did get into some of those fights over woke policies and whatnot. Do you think there's an ability to bring that work from last year over and keep it focused really on those, as you said, those outstanding issues?
I believe so, yes. It's certainly going to be our mission, and I know that I've already had early conversations with Representative Fallon, who's going to be my colleague on the other side, the chairman of the subcommittee, and I believe that his intent as well is to continue that work of quality of life rather than the other work from past Congresses.
We got a chance to sit down with him just a couple of days ago
Good.
and talk about his priorities. He said that recruiting was going to be really the main focus. I know that's something that you've looked at for a while and the committee has been looking at for a while. Talk to me about your concerns right now, though, with some of what you've seen with the new administration, some of the policies and the rhetoric about women in the military, minorities. I mean, do you think that there's any way to talk about that without getting into some of those fights?
So I am concerned, frankly. We are seeing a turn in the quality in terms of the volume of people who are committing themselves to a life in the military. And I think that we had turned the corner sometime last year in terms of recruiting, having less and less of an issue with each of the services meeting their recruiting goals. And I think that I do worry that with an elevated conversation about minorities in the military or women in the military, that will suppress people who are interested in joining. I have not just anecdotal evidence, but specific evidence that people who had intended on either going to the academy or maybe enlisting, who happen to be women, are making different choices than they would have. And that's tragedy. That's a tragedy. There are 51% of our population who are women. More than 20% of our military right now are women, and we expect that it would be more than 30% in the next 10 years who are women. And if women feel as though they're not welcome in a place like our military, then they have other choices to make and they have other options to go to. In my community, our unemployment rate is less than 3%, and so the military is competing with the civilian economy, and that's why the quality of life issues are so important to not just women who may be interested in enlisting or matriculating into the military, but everybody. And that's why it's really, really important that we keep the politics out of the military and allow them to be soldiers and sailors and airmen and guardsmen, guardians as well.
So, I mean, you're a veteran, you served. What are you telling these folks right now when they are? If there's a young woman who's interested in joining, she says, I have a lot of concerns about what I'm hearing. How are you advising them? What are you telling them?
It's hard. It's a hard conversation because I think that you can't be what you can't see, and I think it's important that we continue to join in numbers and make sure that our military reflects the face of our country. And so I do encourage people of all kinds to continue to join the military, because you can't make progress if you're not there, if you don't have a seat at the table. Listen, I served more than 30 years ago, back when there were fewer women in the military, and I knew that I was outnumbered in many ways, but I also knew that I couldn't expect things to get better if I wasn't one of the people who was there at the table. And so I think we just have to continue to press forward and continue to serve the country.
It's interesting. Representative Fallon, when we chatted with him, talked about that calling and wanting to appeal more to that, especially in the recruiting message, not just talk about the the benefits and some of the stuff, but actually talk about the career calling, the value of that stuff. Is that still something that you think can resonate when we are seeing the force getting pulled into a more political conversation?
I do think that it's a special kind of person who raises their hand, who volunteers to be part of an all-volunteer service. And I do think patriotism is a significant part of that, and service is a significant part of that. That doesn't that doesn't mean that we can't take care of people, that we shouldn't continue to take care of them, not only in their active duty life, and that it should be a competitive lifestyle, but also when they become veterans as well. And so while I appreciate that it's a special kind of person who self-selects to be in the military, that does not mean that we should not make sure that we're taking care of people. And so I struggle with conversations about recruiting and trying to recruit into what is a traditional group of people who traditionally join the military, and and go deeper on that. I think it's important for us to go more broadly and make sure that the population at large understands the opportunities and experiences that a person can have when they serve in the military in whatever form they do. Right now, most people who are joining the military have military background, military family, military experience. A very large percentage of them do, but we need to make sure that we're getting to all of the people in the country to explain to them the opportunities and benefits of being part of the military.
So speaking of taking care of those families and those quality of life issues, you mentioned before that there's a couple of unresolved ones from last year. Housing has been a main issue. I know there were some reforms made to that and some issues, but what do you think is realistic for this year, and what do you want to see done in order to improve housing stipends, improve the housing situation for troops?
Well, right now, for whatever odd reason, we end up with giving, I think it's something like 90%, 95% of the housing allowance rather than 100%. And that's sort of bananas. It's counterintuitive. It doesn't make any sense to do that. I also think that we made great progress in the last Congress on a pay raise for kind of E1 through E5. We still need to make progress in the next level up in enlisted in particular to make sure that it's competitive. So I think that we are in agreement on that. Whether or not we're able to find the resources for that, because as you're probably hearing, there is a push both to increase the top line of defense spending, but also to decrease the top line of spending, and it's kind of contradictory. You're hearing on the one hand Secretary Hegseth say find 8% to cut, and on the other hand, just this week we voted on $100 billion more in the defense budget. And so those obviously contradict each other, and the question is always, where do you put that money? Is it towards, if we have more, is it towards yet another submarine, or is it towards making sure that we take care of our men and women in uniform?
And I know that some of the priorities that Secretary Hegseth has outlined where he wants to see that money go are more oriented towards either border security or equipment, drones, and the Virginia-class submarines. But last year you were part of the successful push to make sure that those increases did go to the junior enlisted. Do you think that the higher ranking enlisted is going to be a tougher push, or do you think that when folks really look at the situation, they'll say, hey, this was not just young guys not getting paid well or young men and women getting paid well. It's really the force needs to be better.
Yeah, I was actually quite surprised at how hard it was to get that through. I was really surprised at the pushback that I got, frankly, from some of the senior members of the military on increasing pay for junior enlisted people. I understand that they have to make really tough choices on kind of where to put the resources and dollars, but there is no more important place to put in resources and dollars than in the men and women who serve us, and to have them feel as though they're valued and honored. I think when you talk about recruiting and retention, that's definitely really important. So you're right, it's going to be hard. It's an uphill battle, and it's surprisingly hard to ask for those kinds of things. But it's something that I won't relent on, because sometimes the response was, oh, well, we're helping with housing. Well, we're helping with fill in the blank. You can't eat housing. If you can't afford groceries, you're struggling with other bigger things, and you're more likely to leave, frankly.
Did you get a sense, because I remember you expressing that frustration last year as this was in real time as that was going through, did you get a sense that it was a panic about resources, or was it just a fundamental block with some of the senior military leadership that pay raises just aren't as important as some of their other priorities? or were you just not sure and
You
left
know,
frustrated that you couldn't get
whenever
through?
we had a very extensive process through the quality of life panel where we brought in kind of the senior brass of one form or another, senior enlisted as well, and we brought in a lot of people from various organizations that support and kind of advocate for people in uniform. And the stories were contradictory. The data was contradictory, and that I think was one of the things where when we came back and pushed back and said, "We hear you. You think that this is, that there's no problem with pay raise, but let me show you who we've talked to and what they've articulated, and some large percent of, in this case, in last year's cycle, of our junior enlisted on what amounts to food stamps, what we would have referred to as food stamps. It's outrageous. It's super obscene, particularly in some of the higher cost of living areas. People were really, really struggling. And so I think it's really important. That's my job. My job is oversight. My job is to make sure that we're allocating our very scarce taxpayer dollars and resources appropriately. And so I'll continue to work on that issue.
Well, and speaking of that oversight, you had initiatives in there dealing with daycare, medical care. I mean, how much of the work do you think this year, especially as you go into the authorization bill season here and some of the defense budget stuff, how much is just going to be making sure they actually follow through on all the promises that you guys put out?
That is going to, there's the rub. It's one thing to authorize, there's another to allocate, right, and appropriate. And I think that's what we're going to have to be really forceful on, and making sure that we follow up and make sure that things really happen that we already sort of said were a high priority. And that will be important. And you bring up the issue of childcare. That's another one that I'm super, super passionate about. It's one of the reasons why I separated myself from the military, is such a long wait list and such high cost for childcare made it very, very hard to try to figure out how to literally make ends meet when we were, young parents. And 30-something years later, my daughter is now 33 nearly, it's still an issue. There are still long waiting lists. It is still unaffordable in some cases, and so we still have quite a lot of work to do there too.